tonight we are doing James chapter 5. So grab your Bibles, go and open up the James chapter 5. We have just a couple weeks left in the book of James. I've been enjoying this immensely. I hope you guys have as well. And tonight we're going to be in James chapter 5, verses 7 through 12. 7 through 12 tonight. And what tonight is going to talk about, it's the subject that James has talked about before. He's going to do it again, a subject of patience. Now, anytime that I talk about the concept of patience, I kind of have like a go-to analogy that I usually use. So if I'm talking at a place I talk at a lot, if I'm talking at a new place, wherever it might be, if whatever it is, if the topic has to do with patience, I'm like, I got something. I'm ready to go. And that story is one that I've told you guys before. If you're tuning in for the first time or like, who's this guy? I'll tell it again, a bridge version. But it's the story of my wife, Megan, and myself. Our story involved a great deal of patience. And I'll give you the very abridged version because most of you heard this before. But Megan, while we were dating, we've been now married for almost 13 years. Yeah, this month it'll be 13 years. And while we were dating, she lived in Germany for 2 years. So 2 years of our dating life, she lived over there, far away. And so keep in mind, you have to go back like 14, 15 years before YouTube, before Zoom, before FaceTime, before any way of talking to each other face-to-face other than literally being face-to-face. So for us, over like a 2-year period, there's only 3 times that we saw each other. Now it was for chunks of time. So the first time we saw each other after 6 months of being apart, not seeing each other face-to-face. After 6 months of that, we saw each other for, I think, about 10 days. And then she went back to Germany, and once again, 6 months apart. And then we saw each other for a few weeks this time over the summer, so a little bit longer. That was nice. She goes back again. 6 months go by, and we see each other once again for about 10 days or so, and then another 6 months. So you could add those days up. It's not very many, I don't know, 20, 30 days over a 2-year period that we saw each other face-to-face. It's a long time. And so it involved a great deal of patience. Now, I love telling stories. I especially love telling stories that have to do with me. This is a story that I tell often. And the thing that I find so interesting is that usually this story, when I go places or speak places, it gets requested. It's like a top 10 kind of a hit thing. Not even top 10, like it's really my top number one thing. People ask me like, hey, come speak at this camp or this conference or this thing. Tell that story about you and your wife. It's like, they don't really care about my opinions or my speaking other than just the fact that I have a story with Megan. I'll go for it. Sure. Why not? So it's like this story that resonates and has come up several times. And so like at first, a few times I spoke places and people would ask me to share it. I'm like, this is weird and like our story, but whatever. I'd share the story. Then I look out like at the crowd and like women were weeping. Guys would like stand up and just like slow clap. Couples would renew their vows right on the spot. None of that actually happened. But you know, it was like this thing that like, people liked our story for some reason. So I kept telling it. And I found that one of the things that resonated with people is that it involved patience, which we all have to deal with. And it's also one of the greatest love stories of the modern era. I mean, come on. I can say that because God's the author, so it's okay. I'm allowed to brag about that. But I would tell this story often. And the idea is when you speak to crowds, when you speak to people, especially when you're speaking from God's word, the goal, especially with a story, is to try to relate it to whatever you're talking about. So whatever subject it is, to try to get some stories that help illuminate that topic. The idea is telling a story that would make someone then say, I got it. I get what you're saying now. And there's some speakers that I admire greatly. There's a lot of pastors out there that do such a good job at this, that they take this complex spiritual truth and somehow they can make it just make sense. And that's the goal. And really part of that is the more relatable a story is, the more people are going to connect to it. And so again, I think my and Megan's story, it makes sense because at some point in time, everyone's had to deal with patience. At some point in time, everyone either has or will fall in love. So it works. But it kind of falls short in some ways because only Megan and I experienced that. So people can listen to it and understand, but it's only something that we really lived. So again, it's hard as a speaker to try to find examples that like apply to everyone, to try to find examples that everyone can relate to try to find something that resonates with everyone. Until right now, what we're going through is just like a perfect example of patience that we are all dealing with right now. We are all in a situation. Now, granted, our individual situations are different, But we're all in a situation right now that involves us waiting, that involves us needing patience. So this is like a perfect example of patience. This is perfect that really, again, this James series was planned out months before. And it just happens to be during this time that we're talking about this subject. I think it applies pretty well. So what we're going to look at tonight is, again, going faith that works is what we're talking about through the book of James. So faith that works practices patience. Faith that works practices patience. And I use the word practice intentionally. It's kind of one of those weird words. Like when I was learning guitar, I practiced, and I still continue to practice. When I was playing basketball on a team, I would practice basketball. So there's that idea of like, you do something to get better at it. But then you go to a hospital or a doctor's office, and doctors practice medicine, which me personally, I always kind of thought like, okay, I don't want the guy that's practicing. I want the guy who already knows what he's doing. But that's not what they mean when they say that. The word practice, it kind of can be defined a few different ways. So real quick, let me give you some definitions. So the definition of the word practice, it can mean, like we're talking about practicing, getting better at something. It can mean to perform an activity repeatedly in order to improve. So you repeat something, you do it over and over to improve. Practice. But it can also mean to be engaged in a particular occupation, profession, or skill. So to be engaged in something, you are practicing that thing. And both definitions apply when we talk about patience. We need to be engaged in patience. But not only that, we also have to be always trying to get better at it. We need to constantly be improving, constantly trying to improve our skill. So it works in both ways. Patience, practice patience. So if you have your Bibles, open up to James chapter 5. And also tonight, if you have an actual paper Bible, there's going to be a few times I'm going to ask you to circle or underline a word here, because I want you to notice something that happens in this section. So right away, James chapter 5, verse 7, it says, be patient. So if you have a Bible that you can mark up, you're allowed to do that. Don't worry. Just treat it like a textbook. Circle patient, underline patient, whatever it is you want to do. That word right there, be patient. So he says, be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient. Circle or underline that word. Being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains. Right there in that one verse, James says the word patient twice. Obviously an important subject that he's going to be talking about here. Be patient. And now remember what we talked about last week. James just got done talking about people who are being oppressed by others. And so his follow-up to that is acknowledging that and saying, yes, that happens. But then he says, okay, now with that in mind, be patient. Whatever you're facing, whatever difficulties, whatever trials, whatever oppression, whatever you're facing, be patient. That's his advice. And that's hard to deal with. Having patience is not an easy thing. But here's our first point. Patience is based on trust. Because he also says there, be patient until the coming of the Lord. So be patient. It's based on trust. You're only going to be patient for something that you trust will happen. I'm not really patient that I'm going to win the lottery because I don't think it's ever going to happen. I also never play, so it's really unlikely to happen that I'm ever going to win. But we're patient for things that we actually expect to happen, that we actually think are going to happen. Now, one of the greatest things about this new service out there, the streaming service, Disney Plus, one of the best things about that is it has all this back catalog of old things. So right away, we were going to get Disney Plus. I mean, we like Disney, we like those things. Our kids are going to watch the movies and shows and stuff. And then I found out that I had a lot of stuff from when I was growing up. And I think really the best thing about it is the fact that it has the 90s Spider-Man cartoon. That's right. You need to check this out. There's lots of Spider-Man cartoons on there, but it has the one from 1990, probably 4-ish, somewhere around there. And it's from the 90s. I think it's just called Marvel Spider-Man, I think, or something. But anyways, it's on there, and it's amazing because it's what I watched as a kid growing up. So I've been taking my kids through it to watch it. Now, the thing is, though, in the 90s, when I was a kid, there was no binging. There was no one episode, then another episode, then another episode. They came out once a week, and that's how you watched them. So for me as a little kid, what I had to do then on a Saturday morning, I had to get up, and I think it was like 8 or 8:30 when it was on. I had to be ready in front of the TV to watch Spider-Man. And if you missed a week, oh well, that was it. I mean, there was really no chance to ever watch it again. Maybe a repeat would come on, maybe, but are you going to catch that one on that repeat? Probably not. So you had to be there. You had to commit. It was like a serious thing. So taking my kids through this show that I watched as a kid, I'm not letting them binge watch it. I'm taking them through it the way I went through it. We watch it on the weekend. And the cool thing about this show, I'm going to get way off topic here, but it's a great show. The cool thing about this show is it was very similar to the comics. So what it would do, it would take a lot of characters and it would like mix them together from other comics too, X-Men and Punisher and Daredevil. They would come in for a while. And what it would also do is comic books often have like series of long storylines to be continued. It would go for several parts. And this cartoon for kids did that, which was like unprecedented. So they had like 10, 14 part shows that would just go on to be continued. And so last week we were watching one and it was over and it said to be continued. And my kids were like, can we watch the next one? I'm like, we can, absolutely. Next week. And that's what we're doing. We have to wait until this weekend because I'm just such a mean dad like that. But it's serious. That's all you have to do. You have to be patient. But they also are able to wait because they know when it's the day. Because one thing I do is when it's the weekend, I get my Spider-Man mug for coffee in the morning. So they're like, Spider-Man mug. Today's Spider-Man day. We're watching Spider-Man. But they know it's going to happen. So they can be patient because they expect that thing to happen. For us, we know that Jesus will return. So in the midst of anything we face, we can be patient because we know that. It's what gives us the ability for us to be patient. Now, James gives an example here, he says, of a farmer. And think about a farmer. You want to talk about patience. A farmer had to wait for rain. Like they just had to wait for rain to come. I mean, there wasn't sprinkler systems. They had some irrigation they tried to make with canals and stuff. But I mean, man, rain. And it says here, especially the early and the late rain. Now in Israel, about 3/4, 75% of the rain falls between about December and February. So most of the rain comes there. But the most important rains is the first rain and the last rain. That's what helps their crop. So those are the most important ones. And they can't really do anything to make those happen. They have to just be patient. And they expect it and they hope for it and they wait, but they have to wait. They can't force the weather to come. And also think about the way farming works. You can't force a crop to appear overnight. It takes time. It takes patience. You know, we talk a lot as Christians about like the fruit of the Spirit. You know, we want to have love and we want to have joy and peace and patience, self-control, those things. But we also, I think, expect those things to come overnight. Okay, God, I'm praying today for joy. It didn't work. Like any fruit, it takes time to develop. It takes time for it to come. That's what he's talking about here. It takes time for a crop to appear. One of my old professors when I was at William Jessup University, his name was David Nystrom. And he says it this way. He says, James wants us to shift our attention from what's happening to us to what God is forming in us. James wants us to shift to just look at what's happening to us to what is God forming in us. I think the same would be said during this quarantine time. Not just looking at what's happening to us, which certainly it's not fun, it's not an easy thing, but instead of just focusing on that, we can also focus on what is God forming in me? What is God forming in us? I think it's a question we can all ask. He goes on now, look at verse 8. You also be patient. Circle that one or underline that one, patient. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. So just as a farmer is patient, you also be patient. And keep in mind, patience is not the same thing as like inaction. It's not the same thing as doing nothing. I mean, a farmer, while they're waiting for the rain, they're working, they're busy, they're occupied. So no matter what's going on, we can continue to work for Jesus. Remember what it says in Colossians 3:23, whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men. Whatever you're doing during this time, you can be serving Jesus in some way, even as we're waiting, even as we're having to be patient. And it says there to establish your heart. That means to like plant it on something that's firm or something that's permanent. And our hearts, again, it's based off of the promises of Jesus. We have this hope that we will be with him. We have this hope that he will come again. We have this hope of eternal life, and we keep that in mind, keeping that bigger perspective like we've talked about. So we have to focus on that. And once again, spiritual maturity, it happens over time. It's not an immediate thing. In our culture, we're so used to immediate, instant gratification. I mean, Amazon Prime we have, right? And you can do like 2-day shipping, which is amazing. And then they started doing like 1-day shipping. That's amazing. Then they started doing like, you could get this the same day. That's amazing. But then with everything happening, they kind of slowed back a little bit. I remember going on there to order something. It would say like, it'll arrive in 1 to 2 weeks. And I was like, 1 to 2 weeks? I can't wait for this thing that I'm going to forget that I ordered for 1 to 2 weeks. I want it right now. We're just used to that. We're used to things being immediate. But instead we're told, be patient. Things take time. We have to wait. My daughter Melina, she got by the mail, she got some caterpillars that were going to turn into butterflies. And so they come and like these little tiny caterpillars and they get bigger and eventually they make a cocoon. Eventually they turn into butterflies. Right now they're waiting over there. They're in the cocoon stage. But she got them like last Monday. And by the next day, by Tuesday, she was already saying like, I wonder if today they're going to be butterflies. And they're still like little caterpillars crawling around. And it takes time. She found out, she like read the directions and it said 10 to 13 days. Like, wait a minute. I thought it was going to be right away. She had to learn patience. All kinds of situations in life, we have to learn patience. There's that saying a watched pot never boils. Now, of course, it eventually will. You have it on heat. But the saying is that if you sit there and watch a pot of water, it feels like it takes forever to boil. But if you go and do other things, you come back and it's going. It takes the same amount of time no matter what, but your perspective has changed. If you stare at it and watch, it's going to feel like forever. If you go do other things, it's going to feel like it goes faster. The principle there, again, is we can choose to have patience or not. Either way, things are going to take as long as they're going to take. So our attitude is really the only thing we can affect, the only thing that we can change. I don't know when all this shelter in place is going to be lifted. It's going to take as long as it's going to take. But in the midst of it, what do we do? In the midst of it, how do we behave? In the midst of it, what are we going to focus on? What's happening to me or what God is forming in me? We have a choice. That's what James is talking about. Look what he says in verse 9. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. So when we think of grumble, we think like complaining, right? I just grumble about it. I complain. And to be honest, during this time, it's been however many weeks now, I have complained a lot. I can tell you guys, I definitely have. I'm sure maybe some of you as well, if we're being honest. I've complained a lot during this time. That's not exactly what he's talking about here. He's saying grumble against one another. Now, we certainly don't want to have a spirit of grumbling or a spirit of complaining. Specifically what he's saying here, though, it's the Greek wording used there. It's talking about basically an inner attitude of resentment, an inner attitude of grumbling, an inner attitude of complaining. So not even voicing it to someone, but just kind of looking at someone with judgment, looking at someone with resentment, and just keeping that inside. He's saying, don't do that. Because during times of stress, we are going to be more likely to lash out at other people. We're going to be more likely to lash out at each other. And we've seen this happen time and time again. We can go all the way back to the beginning. Genesis 3. They sin. They fall. God says, what happened? Stressful moment, right? So what do they do right away? Adam's like, it was the woman. And he's like, by the way, the woman you gave me, God. Bold move. And Eve's like, oh, it was a snake. Like right away, they're blaming. They're grumbling against each other. It's just our natural human tendency. James is saying, don't do that. We need to have patience. And here's the thing too. We need to practice patience, not only in times that are stressful. We need to practice it in times that aren't, so that when those difficult times come, we're ready to use it. We're ready to actually show that we have patience. Because if we start letting bitterness and resentment grow, it's going to take root and it's going to be a much bigger thing. A grumbling spirit has to be fed. So we have to stop before it even takes root, before it even gets a foothold. He says, don't even start. Just before you even get that, don't have that attitude. Don't grumble. Don't complain against each other. It's like when someone does something that we don't like or doesn't do something that we do want them to do. Then we can have this attitude of judging, this attitude of complaining against them. And usually not to their face, but usually talking to somebody else behind their back and saying, man, I can't believe so-and-so did this, or I can't believe so-and-so wouldn't do this. Can you believe that? And we start to have that resentment build. And James says, don't do that. I can't count the number of times that I have been wrong about like a judgment that I've made. mean, just on a daily basis even. I mean, my kids, like now that I'm home more, my kids will like walk to the pantry to get something out. And I'll be like, hey, what are you doing? Like, you shouldn't be doing that. And they're like, well, mom just told us to. I'm like, oh, okay, well then, yeah, then you're fine. I mean, I can't even make an accurate judgment about something little like that in my own house. What business do I think I have making a judgment against someone else's life? And we always think that we know exactly what's going on in someone else's life. We always look from the outside and we think, oh, I understand what's happening and I would make these different choices. I would make these different decisions. Here's what I would do that would be better than what this person's doing. But we really don't know the full situation. It's kind of like a joke that everyone basically is a better parent before they have kids. It was true for me, definitely. I would see other people with kids, I'd be like, man, I'll never do that. Or my kids will never do that. And then I have kids and I'm like, oh, right, I understand now. That makes more sense. Or I'd say things like, I'm just going to tell my kids things and they're just going to listen. Oh, pre-parenthood Michael. So silly. It's not how it is. I was a much better parent before I was a parent, at least in my own head, because I was judging things I had no experience of, that I didn't understand. I was perceiving from my point of view, but I was wrong. God is the only one who really knows the fullness of everyone's situation. So he's the only one that can accurately judge. And James says here, we need to keep in mind that God's like right there. He says, you know what? You guys got to be on guard. The judge is standing at the door. This totally reminds me of me with my kids. Like when they go to bed at night, we put them to bed. Okay, good night, do the whole thing. And then we tell them, okay, it's time for bed. So they need to not be like talking and laughing and yelling and fighting and getting up and getting toys. They don't, bedtime. So sometimes I'll stand at the door and just listen. And at first, a few times, they didn't really know I was doing that. So I would like just wait, like make stomping noise as I'm walking in the hall, but not really walking, just waiting and listening. And then sure enough, I'd hear like little feet get out and I hear toys start playing. So I'd open the door and be like, ha, gotcha, back in bed. But now they got wise to it. They know dad is at the door. So let's not do any of those things. It's talking the same way about Jesus. We need to not have this attitude of judgment. First off, it's just wrong, but also keep in mind that the true judge is right there. So we need to be thinking also, what would Jesus want me to behave in this situation? How would he want me to be in this situation? And so really what we have to do, we have to look for positive things, to look for things in others that are beneficial things. And again, I'm not saying that everyone makes right decisions, because obviously everyone doesn't. And we've even talked about judging earlier and what that actually means and how we are meant to look at the fruit of people's lives. What he's saying here is to not have an attitude that says, I know better than this person. I am better than this person. That as we are in the midst of suffering, we wouldn't want others to judge us. When others are in the midst of suffering, we shouldn't likewise judge them. Look at verse 10 now. As an example of suffering and patience, circle, underline, patience. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. So prophets, right? Chosen by God to speak on his behalf. And we look at that and we say, man, what a blessing. That's so cool that like God talked to them. They heard God. They could converse with God. Like, what a cool thing. What a blessing. What an amazing thing that must have been. Yeah. But also think about like the hardships that they faced. We look at Hebrews 11, Hall of Faith. This amazing thing happened. This amazing thing happened. This person had faith. And look what they did. And look. And then we get to the end, Hebrews 11, 36 and 37. Oh yeah, and others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated. Chosen by God, but they suffered. Not only did they suffer, though, but they endured. They were patient in the midst of that. So our second point is that being patient doesn't guarantee the outcome you want. It's like, okay, if I'm going to be patient, I'm going to get exactly what I want out of this. I'm going to be patient and wait, and then on the other end, God's going to give. That's not how it always works. The prophets were patient, they endured, and some of them had pretty rough lives. Some of them had things that worked out great. Some of them didn't. God doesn't keep us always from suffering, but God always keeps us as we go through suffering. He's with us. He helps us through suffering. So obedience is necessary for the Christian life. We need to be obedient, but it doesn't mean it will always be easy. I mean, Jesus is the ultimate example to the Father, right? And where did it lead him? To the cross. Fully obedient, 100% obedient to the cross. And so he's telling us, look at these examples, so that as you go through times of suffering, you have something to look at and say, they did it, I can do it. Now, Jesus is perfect, so it's like, well, it's a pretty high bar. But these prophets and other people in the Bible, they weren't. And yet they endured, yet they got through it. So we can look at them and see, I can do it too. And the important thing to understand is that your mindset affects your behavior. My daughter was taking a test today, and she was getting all stressed out about it. She's like, oh, it's a test. I don't know what to do. I said, you know what? You know it. Just tell yourself you can do this. Because your mindset affects your behavior. To give you an example in the sports world, I can't remember who it was exactly. I forgot the guy's name. But sometime in the early 1900s, there was a guy who was the first one recorded to break the 4-minute mile. It's pretty amazing, 4-minute mile. So he was the first one to do that. But since then, tons of people have done that. Since he did that, I mean, not only have like professional athletes done it, but college students have done it. Some even really, really talented high school students have done that. And so why? What happened there? There's a few reasons. First off, we have technology. So I have one of my old running shoes here. And these things are a lot lighter. They're engineered to help us go faster. They're kind of like almost as like a... These things are really made to help us. Now, even though I have this piece of technology, I am not going to do a 4-minute mile. I didn't know that was possible. I didn't know like an 8-minute mile was possible because I'm not doing those. But this helps. Even more than that, though, what they've found is like an area basically called sports psychology. That once your mind knows something's possible, you are more likely to attempt it. You are more likely to see it as possible and actually maybe overcome that. So as more people know that a 4-minute mile can be done, more people are like, well, what do I need to do? How do I need to train? How can I get to that same point? I remember like in the Winter Olympics, I don't remember which one it was, 8 years ago, maybe or so. But Shaun White is an incredible snowboarder. And he would do these things in the Winter Olympics that were just crazy, that no one had ever seen, like these tricks that he made up. And then 4 years later, though, everyone was doing those things. So this thing that seemed incredible and impossible, within 4 years, it was normal because of mindset. So for us, as we endure times of suffering and times of hardship, we need to look at others who have done the same and say, yes, they did it, I can do it. Others have gone before. Others have faced huge challenges. Different challenges, certainly, but they remained faithful. You can remain faithful as well. Look at verse 11 now. Behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. I mean, if anyone got a raw deal, it was Job, right? He had wealth, he had kids, he had a family, he had everything going for him, and it was all pretty much taken away. I mean, all of a sudden, he lost his wealth, his kids died, his friends came and accused him of some secret sin. His wife told him, curse God and die. He had it rough. He suffered, but he endured it all, and he never turned from God. Now, he's not a great example of being like super patient, obviously. He endured, but I mean, also in like Job 13:15, he says, look, though God slay me, I will hope in him. Yet I will argue my ways to his face. So I'm going to argue. I'm going to keep hoping and trusting in God, but I'm going to argue a little bit here. And that's normal. That's what Job did. And we know the end of the story. He got twice what he had. He got new kids, all this kind of stuff. But it's still rough. He still lost his other kids. You know, he still lost his wealth. He still lost a lot of things. So his true reward wasn't just more wealth and a bigger family. His true reward is that he got a bigger peek, a bigger sight of the character of God. That was his true reward. And God brought good from that disaster. That's what God can do. So it doesn't diminish how bad a disaster is. Disasters are disasters. But we can, again, see it's not just what happens to us. It's what God can form in us. I mean, I have to be honest, even during this time, there are aspects of what's happening right now that I am thankful for. Now, I'm not saying I'm thankful for any of the negative things that are happening. People have died. People have lost their jobs. People lost their businesses. All of that is horrible. And none of that do I think is caused by God. What I'm saying, though, is that even in the midst of this time of difficulty, God is still at work. God didn't just like stop or leave. He's still doing things. And so I'm seeing God's fruit in my life and in the life of others as well from this time. How is God causing you to maybe view things differently? What is God doing in our lives that maybe we're seeing him at work? What is God forming in you during this time? How is patience being produced? How is steadfastness? What is God reprioritizing in your life? Our third point is that you have to endure something to gain endurance. We all want endurance, but the way you gain endurance is by enduring something. Endurance competition. You have to go and you have to do that to get better and better and better at it. We have to endure things in our life to have more endurance for later in life. We have to endure to gain endurance. Finally, now look at verse 12. He says, but above all, my brothers, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth, or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes, and your no, no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. Now, when he says don't swear, he's not speaking of like profanity. Certainly the Bible would tell us not to do that as well. But what he's specifically saying here is like swearing, like, oh, I swear to God, or I promise, or I swear by this, or I swear this. He's saying don't do that. Instead, just say, this is what I'm going to do, and then do it. Now, it seems kind of out of the blue, but think about the context. Suffering. When we're suffering, we are more likely to say things we don't really mean. We're more likely, I mean, I'm sure we've all done this, to try to bargain with God, to get out of our suffering. He's saying, don't do that. Don't make rash words. Don't make quick things that you say. Don't do that. Regardless of what we're facing, our word should be our word, no matter what we face. So our fourth and final point, the truth isn't always the quickest, but it's always the best. James is telling us just tell the truth. It's not always the quickest, but it's always the best, because there is this idea that they could get around the truth by making oaths. In Leviticus 19:12, it says, you shall not swear by my name falsely. So everyone knew you can't swear by God's name falsely. So they would get around that by being like, well, I swear by heaven. I swear by Jerusalem. I swear by my own head. And they would make things up. And then they would get out of it later on and be like, well, I didn't really swear by God, so it's okay. They were not intending to be truthful. And even sometimes when we mean to be truthful, we can't control what happens tomorrow. So instead, we just do our best. We say yes when we mean yes. We say no when we mean no. We don't let suffering impact that or make us say things rashly. We just keep our word. Somehow my kids have found out this thing about, when you cross your fingers behind your back. So you say something, and as long as you do this, you don't have to keep it. And they thought it was like this magical thing. Like all of a sudden now, they can say whatever they want because of this. And we had to tell them, no, that's still lying. No, but I did this. No, that doesn't matter. Yes is yes, no is no. We do this sometimes without holding our fingers. We do this in our mind. We'll tell people something. Yeah, I'll totally do that. And inside we're like, nope, not going to happen. Or the vice versa. We'll say we won't, but we will. And it's just this idea that we can say things without actually following through with action. And again, we're being told here, don't do that. Don't do that. We need to tell the truth. We need to stick to our word, no matter what we're facing. So basically, to sum up what James is saying here, he's essentially saying that in all areas of life, we need patience. In anything we face, good times, bad, whatever it is, we need to practice patience. But here's the thing, how? How do we actually do this? There's an old saying that goes, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Elephant's a big thing. If you're going to eat it, well, the only way to do it is just one bite at a time. How do you practice patience? You do it one day at a time. You do it step by step. As we've seen throughout James, everything is about a slow progression, continuing in the right direction. There's no quick fixes. There's no instant things. We have to just day by day practice patience. In that next situation that comes up, practice patience. And the one after that, practice patience. And the one after that, practice patience. It's a day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, slow progression forward. I remember one of the first times that I studied the book of James, I was probably 18 or 19. So I went through it, and I remember thinking, I need patience. And so I prayed. I said, God, help me be more patient. Now, several years later, it's not like I just magically got patience. I kind of thought the next day God would give me the gift. Here's patience. Open it up. Yeah, I'm patient now. Woohoo, it worked. No, it's been a very slow progression over the years. Now, what I can do, though, I can look back, and I can see I was more patient than I was then. It hasn't been instantaneous. And I also know that I have a long way to go with patience. It's a day-by-day thing. You practice patience by doing it today, and then tomorrow, and then the next day in each situation. But also set up things in your life that you can look and you can see, yeah, I'm more patient than I was then. Or I handle that situation well. I mean, maybe for you, it could be journaling. It could be writing things down, a prayer journal, whatever it might be. Ways that you can look and see that you have made progress, that you are continuing to do better. Ways that we can set up and see, I did something. I progressed. They used to do this with like altars they would set up. There's one even several times in the Old Testament that talks about this. One of the songs that is Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, it talks about, here I raise my Ebenezer. Ebenezer, in the book of 1 Samuel, there's an area where they go and they set up this stone, and Samuel calls it Ebenezer. Not like Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol, Ebenezer. And it meant stone of help. And they're setting this thing up saying, okay, God helped us. This is going to remind us that God is a help. We're going to look back at this and see that God is a help. So in your own life, set those things up that you can look back and see. Have an accountability partner. Have, like I said, a journal, a prayer journal, something that you look at and say, I wasn't that patient today. I want to try better tomorrow. And then progressively, you can look back and see, I've gotten better at this. We all want to know, how do we become more patient? Well, it's just a day at a time. It's a situation at a time. It's a slow progression. But truly, if we go to God, if we seek to be patient, he will help us accomplish that. He will help us do better. We can look at other examples of people. We can look at our own attitude. We can look at our lives, and we can just see where we need to improve, but also how we've improved. And God will walk us through that. Again, he won't always have us avoid suffering, but he'll always help us through the suffering. And we will endure. We will gain patience little by little. That's tonight's section, guys, of James chapter 5. I hope, once again, that you are enjoying this as we go through it. I hope you're getting something out of it. And through it all, I hope even as we're taking time to go through, you're being patient with that. But through all of this, I hope that you're seeing what it looks like to have a working faith. Not because it's what Pastor Michael says, no, because it's what the Word of God says. What does a working faith look like? It's a faith that works every single day after day, a slow progression. That's what we're going for. As always, thanks, guys, for hanging out. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for just sitting with me. It's nice knowing you're out there, and we'll get through this a day at a time. And eventually, we'll be back together. Eventually, we'll be face-to-face. But until then, one day at a time, slowly, patiently, we'll endure together with each other, and also together with the help of God. Love you guys. I will talk to you next time.